What we're going to be going over here is manufacturing overhead costs and their associated variances. And what we're going to be doing is calculating variable and fixed overhead variances here. And it's going to be based on a standard costing system where we're going to be using a flexible budget. So what I've done here, I've got it laid out in T account form here, and we're going to be tracking these variable and fixed overheads through these T accounts to calculate their variances. So what I'm going to do here first is just conceptually go through what we're going to be doing, and then we'll go back and we'll do the actual calculations. So when we're talking about these variable and fixed overhead variances, we really start with our actual costs here. So we're going to accumulate our actual costs for both the variable and fixed overheads here, and then they're going to be moved into a manufacturing overhead account here as a total amount. And then when they're going to be moved out of the manufacturing overhead, they're going to be moved into the work in process control account here. And it's going to come in at their standard cost, the standard or budgeted cost. And there's going to be a difference here between the actual costs for these variable and fixed overheads versus their standard cost. And then the difference is going to come into the variances that we're going to have to account for. So our variable portion of the overhead, we're going to have a spending variance here. And along with that variable overhead, we're going to have an efficiency variance that we're going to be calculating. And then along with it, we're going to have a fixed overhead. Again, we're going to have a spending variance here. And then with this fixed overhead, we're going to have what they call a production volume variance. Okay, so before we get into our calculations, this is what we want to work off. I've got a key here, and all the references that I have in the T accounts for the calculations are based on this key that I'm looking at here. So this is what we really want to understand, this key here, or get these jotted down here to reference back to when we're making our calculation. So SVOR, showing everything in red here, equals our standard variable overhead rate. And that's on a per hourly basis here. And SFOR stands for the standard fixed overhead rate here. And then AHU is our actual hours that we've used. And SHA stands for the standard hours allowed. And then DH, that's really a total budgeted direct labor hours here. And they refer to it as the denominator hours here. So understand what that DH is. So when we're talking about the denominator hours, it comes into our equation here when we're calculating our standard variable overhead rates here. So what you would do here, looking at our standard variable fixed overhead rate, you just take your total fixed costs here for the period that you're budgeting here, and then you divide it by the total direct labor hours on the standard basis that you have for the period, and that would equal here the standard fixed overhead rate. So you take your total fixed costs here, divide them by your total direct labor hours that you have budgeted, both budgeted amounts here, and you're going to come up with that per hour rate. Okay, and that's based it on the budgeted amounts. Just to understand what we're talking about, the DH, the total budgeted direct labor hours here, what they refer to as the denominator hours. Okay, so now let's go and do our calculations. Okay, we'll start with, we have in our miscellaneous accounts, we're going to have accumulated our fixed and variable overheads at their actual cost. So for our variable cost here, we're going to have $121,500 here accumulated at the actual cost, and our fixed portion is going to be $242,500. Again, the actual cost here for the period. So let's go through this example just based on a monthly basis or whatever period we're looking at here. So we have a total of variable and fixed overhead of $364,000. So that's what we're going to have moved into our manufacturing overhead account, where we're looking for the total fixed overhead and plus the total variable overhead. So it comes in here, debit your manufacturing overhead control account here for $364,000. Now it's going to come out of the manufacturing overhead control account here at $320,000, and that is going to be the standard cost that we're going to be working with. It's going to come out of the manufacturing overhead control account, and it's going to be moved into the work in process control account at the standard cost. So let's just look at that here. So we have $364,000 coming in here at the actual cost for the variable and fixed, and now the $320,000 going to flow out here. So let's look at that. To calculate our our standard cost here, you just take the standard variable overhead rate, and for our example, it's going to be $30 here. Plus, you would add to it the standard fixed overhead rate, and that's going to be $50 on an hourly basis here, direct labor hours. And total amount here would be $80 times the standard hours allowed here. This is for our standard, or for our standard costing here. We're only going to, we have a standard hours allowed or allotment here based on our standard costing system, and that's going to be for 4,000 hours. So our standard hours allowed here is 4,000 times the $80 here total amount. You're going to come up with $320,000. So that's really our standard cost. Now we're going to have to compare this $320,000 to the actual cost here, $364,000, and break it apart here for those spending variances and efficiency variances and so on. But first off, let's just understand this, what these standard variable overhead rates are here, and the fixed overhead, standard fixed overhead rate. So just for example, this is what we're talking about. Say we're on our budgeted amount here, we're looking at $15 per hour here for a labor rate here, cost of $15 per hour set at some standard. That would be our standard labor rate. And we're charging off $30 here in standard fixed overhead, a standard variable overhead rate here of $30 per hour. So really what that's saying here is we take our labor rate here at $15 an hour, our standard rate, and you divide it into the standard variable overhead rate here, $30 per hour. So we're coming up with a 200% variable overhead rate here based on direct labor dollars. So for each $15 we have spent in direct labor here, we can take 200% of that times the $15, and we're going to come up with our variable overhead rate here on a per hourly basis here of $30. Same for our fixed overhead rate. And these are budgeted amounts that we've established for the period here on a standard basis here. So for our standard fixed overhead rate here at $50 per hour, you can look at it in these terms. You have your labor rate here, $15 per hour, divide it into the $50 per hour here for the standard fixed overhead rate, and you're going to come up with an overhead rate here for fixed overhead rate here of 333%. So when we're talking about it in terms of standard dollars here, or say a $15 we spend here in labor or direct labor, take 333% of that, and that's going to give you your standard fixed overhead rate here of $50 per hour. Just so you understand what's going on here when we're talking about those standard variable overhead rates here and standard fixed overhead rates. They're really based on dollar amounts, dollars that you have on a labor rate, or labor rate dollars that you would have. You can relate them to your labor rate dollars per hour. That's all I'm saying. You establish some standard here for both your standard fixed overhead rates and your standard variable overhead rate here and your standard fixed overhead rate. Those are established at the beginning of the year, the beginning of the period, and you use them throughout the year here. So this is what we're talking about, their standard cost here. So now we have to go back here and calculate the difference here for those variances between what our actual cost was here for both our variable and fixed overheads versus what our standard cost here would be when we include both our variable and our fixed overheads. Okay, so let's go do that here. So let's start with our variable overhead rate here as the spending variance here. And what you do here is you just take your actual overhead, actual cost that you have, and that was $121,500 that we had up here, $121,500, our actual cost, and then you would subtract that, your standard fixed overhead rate times your actual hours used. So you have to work with your standard here for your variable overhead rate here and look at it as based on your actual hours used. So our standard variable overhead rate here we had set here at $30 per hour times our actual hour used, and for this example it had to be 4,100 hours here. The actual hours here, labor hours that we spent. Okay, see that multiplies out to $123,000. Compare it to your actual amount here, $121,500. So you're going to have a favorable, the difference is $1,500, and it's favorable here because your actual amount here 121,500 is less than what we would have had budgeted here based on the actual hours used, 123,000. So the credit, the difference goes to credit here, $1,500 for your spending variance for the variable overhead rate. So you're just looking at your actual amount here that you have and compare it to your standard variable overhead rate times the actual hours used. And whatever difference, in this case, it became a favorable difference here because our actual hours were less than our standard hours that we calculated here. Okay, so that takes care of our spending variance here for the variable overhead rate. Now let's move over here to the variable overhead efficiency variance. This is really the efficiency variance. So what you're taking is you take your actual hours used here and you subtract your actual hours allowed here. That's your standard hours that you're allowed versus the actual hours used. And then you take that times your standard variable overhead rate here. So actual hours used here for the period is 4,100, and our standard actual hours allowed here was 4,000 here. So we got a difference of here times the standard variable overhead rate here of $30. So difference here of 100 hours here times the $30 standard variable overhead rate here is going to give you $3,000 here. So you're going to debit your variable overhead efficiency, the efficiency variance here by for $3,000. And this is unfavorable here because your actual hours used here, 4,100, was greater than your standard hours allowed here of 4,000. So the difference gets recorded as an unfavorable efficiency variable here, $3,000. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is go down here and look at our fixed overhead, and we're going to be looking at what they refer to as the spending variance. So we have a spending variance as well here with our fixed overhead. Again, you're going to do the same thing here. You're going to take your actual hours here that you've had for your fixed overhead here. In this case, was $242,500. And then you would subtract from that the standard fixed overhead rate here times the what they call the denominator hours here, or those were to be the total budgeted direct labor hours here. And for our example, we budgeted in total direct labor hours here 4,800 hours. So that's the total number of direct labor hours here for the period. So the budgeted amount here, taking your standard fixed overhead rate here, $50, times that the DH here, or those budgeted direct labor total budgeted direct labor hours here, 4,800, is going to give you 240,000. Compare it to the actual amount here, 242,500. So the difference is $2,500 here. So that's going to be you're going to debit your fixed overhead rate here for $2,500. It's unfavorable here because the actual amount here is of 242,500 is greater than the budgeted amount here, 240,000. So the key here is just remember this DH here. Those are really your budgeted total direct labor hours here for the period that we're using. Okay, so we've got our fixed variable overhead spending variance here. Then we have, associated with that, we're going to have a production volume variance here based on that fixed overhead. So what you would do here, we're going to be debiting that here for $40,000 unfavorable. And that's based on, again, the DH here, or the denominator hours, or the total budgeted direct labor hours here for the period of 4,800. And you compare that, or you subtract your standard, or your standard hours allowed here. Standard hours allowed, we allowed 4,000 here, and standard hours allowed here for the period. So the difference is going to give you 800 here, and then you take that amount times your standard fixed overhead rate of $50 per hour. So that's going to give you $40,000 here. You're going to debit to your production volume variance. And that's unfavorable here because your denominator hours, or your total hours for the period of 4,800 here, is greater than the standard hours allowed here of $4,000. Okay, so if you do sum up all your debits and credits here, you're going to come up with that $44,000 balance up here. So you take, let's go back down and look at it. You had the $1,500 here credit plus Well, you have only credits you have here, a favorable amount is in your variable spending variance here, $1,500, and then the other one, and then you have the others are unfavorable here. So our fixed overhead variance here, we had a debit of $2,500, and then along with it we have another debit here of $3,000 for a variable overhead efficiency variance, and then adding all that to it, we have that production volume variance here of $40,000. So netting everything up here, we're going to come up with a balance here, and let's go back up to it one. We're going to come up with a balancing amount here of $44,000. That accounts for the variable spending and efficiency variances here, plus the fixed overhead spending and production volume variances. And then what you're going to do here, I'm showing this as a balance because we came in here with that $364,000 actual cost here, and we have that standard cost here, $320,000. So the balance, we have a greater amount here by $44,000, and that's going to be closed out at the end of the period. That's going to go into the costing, our actual costing that we'd have for our balancing amounts. Okay, so you see how we calculated the variances based on the difference here between our actual cost, our standard cost here, and our actual cost for both our variable and our fixed overheads. And we combined them into this one account here, this manufacturing overhead account here. All right, so that takes care of that. All right. Now let's just look at these calculations again here. Just break them apart, looking at our variable overhead costs and their associated variances. We just went through that, but just as a review here, and then we'll look at our fixed overhead costs and their variances. So in looking at them just based on the variable overhead here. Now remember that variable overhead was really part of our manufacturing overhead in our variable dollars. So look, just tracking that through our accounts here. We take our actual cost, that was $121,500, bring that into our variable overhead control account here, and we normally wouldn't have a variable overhead control account. It would be a part of the manufacturing variable overhead total account here, but I'm using that just as our reference here to understand what's going on. So a total cost coming in here is $121,500, and then going out of here is going to be the standard cost. So that's based on our standard variable overhead rate per hour times the standard hours allowed here, $30 here, times 4,000 standard hours allowed. That's going to give us $120,000. So now we just have to account for the difference here between $121,500, our actual amount here, and our standard amount here of $120,000. All right, we'll do that. But just understand here again, the standard variable overhead rate, we calculated that, or was budgeted here on a standard basis for $30 per hour, and our labor rate here is $15 per hour that we've established. So just the division here gives us a 200% here. So our standard variable overhead rate here of $30 is really 200% of our direct labor dollars here at $15. So if you know your direct labor dollars here, you just take 200% times whatever those dollars are, and that's going to give you your standard variable overhead dollars that you'd be looking at. Okay, so going back to our variances here. So looking at our variable overhead for our spending variance, again, just take the actual dollars here, that was $121,500, and subtract from that the standard variable overhead rate times the actual hours used. And our standard variable overhead rate was $30 here times actual hours used, in this example 4,100. So that's going to give us $123,000. Compare it to the actual amount, $121,500, and it's going to be favorable here by difference is $1,500, because the actual amount that we use, or actual of variable overhead here, was less than our budgeted based on the actual hours used. So this what we're looking at here, and for the standard variable overhead rate here times the actual hours used, that's really the budgeted based on our actual hours used. Okay, so we got our variable overhead spending variance here as a favorable amount of $1,500. And then moving over to our efficiency variance here for a variable overhead rate, again, that's just take the actual based on our actual hours used times the minus the standard hours allowed here. So whatever the difference here times your standard variable overhead rate on a per hourly basis. So again, we had 4,100 actual hours used. Our standard hours allowed was 4,000. So times $30 here, that was 100 unit or 100, a difference here of 100 hours times $30 is going to give you $3,000. And it's unfavorable because the actual hours used here is 100 hours more than the standard hours allowed. Okay, so that'll take care of our variable overheads. Now let's look at our fixed overhead, our costs and our variances here. So in this case, again, I've got it broken out here. Just normally this would go into the total manufacturing overhead account, but I've just broken it out here for you to understand what's going on for demonstration purposes. So we take our fixed overhead here, $242,500, and the actual cost here, and move it into our fixed overhead, this control account here, $242,500, and then it's going to go out of the fixed overhead control account here at the standard cost. Okay, well, it's going to go out at the standard cost, but we're recording it here in our fixed overhead control account, and this is what we're really doing. So this is the key here when you're looking at that fixed overhead control account here with the variances, and this is how we came up with that. So we take our standard fixed overhead rate here of $50 per hour and take it times our total direct labor hours that we budgeted, or the denominator hours that they're talking about of 4,800 hours. So $50 times 4,800 hours here gives us $240,000. Now remember, this 4,800 here, that's the original budgeted based on the budgeted direct labor hours, and we're really looking at the total hours here. So that's what you have to come up with. This 4,800 here is the total direct labor hours that was budgeted for the period. Okay, so that gave us $240,000. Now that's going to go into our work in process at the standard cost. So we would do it in this fashion here. We take our standard cost is our standard fixed overhead rate of $50 per hour times the standard hours allowed here of 4,000. So that's going to give us $200,000. So now we can go and we can make our calculations here by coming up with the difference between our actual costs here and our standard cost. Okay, so this is how that works. So we go down to our fixed overhead rate here to calculate our spending variances. Again, we take the actual cost here. That was what our actual cost here was, $242,500, and then we would subtract that from the budgeted amount here. That would be our standard fixed overhead rate times the denominator hours here, or those 4,800 hours, total direct labor hours that we have for the period here of 4,800 hours. Our 4,800 hours, yes. Remember, when I'm talking about this 4,800, that's the total direct labor hours that were budgeted for the period. So $50 here times the denominator hours here, 4,800, is going to give us $240,000. Compare it to the actual amount here of $242,500. So we got an unfavorable amount here of $2,500 because the actual amount that we actually have here for our fixed overhead here is greater than the budgeted amount here, $240,000. $242,500 compared to the budget amount here of $240,000. Okay, based on those total denominator hours, or those total direct hours that we budgeted for the period. So that comes to be your spending variance here, unfavorable. And then moving over to our production volume base variance here for our fixed overhead. And that's simply taking those denominator hours, or a total 4,800 hours here in direct labor, and compare it, and then we would subtract from it the standard hours are allowed here of 4,000 hours. So there's going to be a difference of 800 hours here times your standard fixed overhead rate here, $50 per hour, is going to give you 40,000 here. So that's going to be, again, an unfavorable variance here, because the denominator hours, or the actual that you plan for here, 4,800, is less than the scheduled hours that were allowed here, 4,000. It sounds a little strange here that it would be an unfavorable amount, but that's the way it works here when you come to balancing everything out. So you had two debit amounts here, 40,000 here debit plus a debit here, 2,500, and that adds up to really the difference that we're looking at here, the difference of $42,000, the difference between our $200,000 standard cost here and our actual cost here, $242,500. All right, so that's pretty much what we're talking about here when we're talking about those variable and fixed overhead variances. So that'll end our discussion.